Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Robin Hansen, and I'm a faculty member of the College of Law Speakers Committee. And I'd like to welcome you to our 2023 Morris Schumiatcher Lecture on Law and Literature as part of the college's McKercher Lecture Series. As we gather here today, we acknowledge we're on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I would like to acknowledge McKercher LLP for being the sponsor of the College of Law's lecture series, and would like to invite Robert Affleck, College of Law alumni and partner at McKercher, to bring some remarks. And I'd also like to thank Gordon Oakes for hosting us in this beautiful space, Curtis for all his help, so thank you. So Bob.
I'll be very brief because you're not here to listen to me. McKercher is very proud of its relationship with the College of Law, and particularly the opportunity to bring these kind of lectures, which are both timely, interesting, and insightful to the campus community. So please enjoy, and I look forward to Dr. Lindberg's presentation.
Thank you, Bob. The Schumiatcher Lecture on Law and Literature was created to honor Dr. Morris M. Schumiatcher. In late 1979, Dr. Schumiatcher generously endowed a fellowship at the University of Saskatchewan to establish a series of lectures on law and literature. Mr. Schumiatcher was a well-known lawyer and a freelance writer. Prior to entering law school, Morris Schumiatcher was an English major, and after completing 3 law degrees, the ultimate being a Doctor of Jurisprudence from the University of Toronto, he was included in the drafting of several statutes, including the original Saskatchewan Bill of Rights, which went on to become influential in the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In addition to his career as an advocate in the Canadian courts and before the Privy Council, he was a prolific writer. His writings included several books and articles, and he had been referred to as Canada's legal poet laureate. We'd like to acknowledge the late Jackie Schumiatcher for her support of this lecture over the years. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for today. Professor Lindberg hails from the Assiniboine Kelly Lake Cree Nation and grew up in small cities and towns in northern Alberta and Saskatchewan, including Melfort, Nipawin, Prince Albert. Professor Lindberg studied law at the University of Saskatchewan for her LLB, Harvard Law School for her LLM, and the University of Ottawa for her doctorate. She currently teaches at the University of Victoria Faculty of Law. Professor Lindberg studies, reads, and practices NEA Cree law and works in the area of Indigenous law and literature, Indigenous legal theory, the rejuvenation and application of Indigenous laws, and Indigenous women's societies, laws, and legal orders. Her academic work, Critical Indigenous Legal Theory, won the University of Ottawa's Gold Medal and the ProQuest Distinguished Dissertation Award. Her best-selling novel, Birdie, is widely read and taught in courses worldwide. Dr. Lindberg's next work will be on bookshelves this fall. It is called Sakihitawin, the Cree word for love, and features 16 intertwined stories about the spectrum of love tied to 20 pieces of art by Cree painter George Littlechild. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tracey Lindberg.
The coffee does not fit. Tanse, ne wakamaganak, katitamska and awa oma, kataskawa, kape to go tayan, eguamina, ninanasko mawagojik, kape wi samtik, kape spixwian, hi hi. Thank you to the people originals to this territory. Thank you to the people who invited me to come and who have hosted me. Thank you to relations in the room, and thank you particularly to my relatives. I'll do this, Maria. I have great joy in being here today, and I also have, as most artists do, profound sadness at the same time. So these two are flowing back and forth. I went to university at the University of Saskatchewan, it's true, and while here, Leo Lachance was shot in Prince Albert in the back while he was leaving a business. I lived here when there was a serial killer killing Indigenous women that we knew of, one at the time. And when I left here and moved away, I still think of this place as home, but I think of it as home not for just having survived it, but for having built the family that I carry with me to this day. So I love this territory, I love this treaty land, and I love the people in it. And I'm also in a very complicated and I would say probably abusive relationship with Saskatchewan. Priscilla, if you can do the first one. I'm going to talk to you today about law stories as love stories, treaties, Cree law, and the promise. And I want to make note because I contacted George Littlechild. George and I are working on the next book together. I asked him for permission to use his art that is showing in the book in this presentation today. Some of it is mishmashed and pieced together, but I've tried to be thoughtful in my curation of it. But if you have interest in his art, please look at georgelittlechild.com. But also, if you want to use it, reference it, replicate it, you need to contact him because, well, aside from Canadian copyright law, that's the Cree law and the right thing to do. If you can bring down the first one. When I do that introduction that now is 20 years old in Cree phonetically, that was given to me by someone in the room, I'm aware that as I'm participating in it, that I'm acknowledging the relationship that I have with this territory, and I also acknowledge the obligation that I have to this space. In that obligation and responsibility, I don't do this as a nicety. I take this seriously every time and think about the peoples whose land it is, and do I have the right to be here? Am I, as an Indigenous person, am I invading? That phrase, when people use guest, I often feel uncomfortable with it because guests are mostly invited. So I try to parse out what that looks like. In my school, at the law school that I teach at currently, Priscilla, if you can do the next slide, when we talk about lawful requirements, I sometimes call this the passport, that we're talking about the passport. One more, please. But I'm trying to look towards what the lawful requirement would be for me to be here. And lots of times when I'm looking at that lawful requirement, I'm looking to try to understand not my place, not my particular standing, my relationship certainly, but starting with the land, the more than humans, and the humans who are original to this territory. What those passport look like, what that legal obligation is, what my relationship is something that I consider deeply every time I show up. If you want to flip one more, Priscilla. In examining what kind of relationship that I have told you what my relationship with Saskatchewan is like. I also like to tell people, are there any law students in the room? Well, this is just for you then. I failed the Saskatchewan bar exam. And I tell people that because I also got an A+ in my dissertation at Harvard. That disjointedness between testing and who you are and your ability to think and rationalize and be critical is a tenuous one. If you're online and you're listening to this, you can learn that that the exams are just a thing that you have to do, that the skill set that you take with you and build with you and take to other places is the important part. In this conversation today, I'm going to talk about a couple of things. I'm going to talk about the impossible versus the fantastic. Impossible and for fantastic. And I'm going to talk about it in terms of a storytelling round. I'm going to tell a story in pieces and ways that make it legally cognizable to me as a person whose mum is Cree, whose mum is Esqueo. I'm going to compare and contrast that understanding where I come from and what I know with Canadian law and Canadian understandings of family and justice and obligation. And in part of this conversation, I've thought of it as the impossible versus the fantastic because of a number of reasons. An example I can give you is my first month on campus as a university professor. One of my colleagues said, "So you were one of those people who believe that you came from a buffalo?" And I said, "Yeah, that's the story." And he said, "But do you actually believe that?" And I said, "Yes, I believe that." And from there on in, I was sort of marginalized as somebody who didn't live in a possible world, somebody who dealt in the fantastic or dwelled in the fantastic and couldn't be taken seriously. And I think that dissonance in that space exercise there is part of where most of the work that lots of us do to understand Indigenous laws and legal orders as normative, as the law, as the particular, is what we have to do. Jim Dumont, Métis poet, thinker, scholar, has said publicly that all origin stories are true stories. And I think about that when I'm thinking about the impossible and the fantastic. What does it look like to be somebody who understands that you can have fantastic in your everyday and that some things coming from other cultures and other places, like a fair trial, justice, are impossibilities? What does that look like? So, Priscilla, once more. I came together with George. I went to George Littlechild's home and said, "Hey, I have a book that I want to talk about." And he said, "Can we write on horses?" I said, "No, George, I can't write on horses. I don't know horses." And he said, "I want to write about horses." And I said, "I want to write about love." And he said, "Oh, it's been done. I'm sick of it." And I said to him, "But George, there's lots of love that isn't written about or talked about or included anywhere, and I want to start talking about that." And he said, "No, I don't think so." And I said, let's talk once in a while and come back to it." And I said to him, one of my elders had said to me, "Saketuen, there is no Cree word for love, that romantic love. That's not the word for it. This is the word that everyone's using." And she's a Cree Métis Michif elder, Cree speaking, Michif speaking elder, who is brilliant, kind, generous, speaks her language, thinks in her language, and I don't have any of that. So that idea that there's no Cree word for love, not romantic love, stuck with me, and I thought that can't possibly be true, because this elder also taught me to be a critical thinker and to ask the questions all the way along, because our laws and our teachings and our understandings can withstand critique and hold up to it. So I thought about that and tried to convey that to George, and then would send him pieces over time where somebody was, there's one story in the book called "The Girl Who Fell in Love with a Crow." And that sounds nice and prolific and, oh, beautiful in pan-Indigenous world, but actually she had sex with a crow. And I speak of it much more crassly in the book. That idea of love and romance and all those gradations of it, when I started sending George pieces and telling him what I was thinking about, that we could love more than humans and we could love through genders and around genders and aside from genders. And I said to him, we used to speak the same language as the deer. We used to speak the same language as the animals, as the more than humans. And not speaking the language of my ancestors is relevant to this and relevant to the book, but also I'm trying to think of it through that veil and that understanding that we used to talk the same language as our four-legged friends and family. And so I don't speak my ancestors' language, and that limits my teachings, but I still hold the remembrance of that old skill of language speaking. I also think of our late friend Harold Johnson and how he implored us to remember always that we are the stories we tell. So in this book, I tell 16 stories, 4 seasons of love, and the story that I'm going to tell you today comes from that. It comes from that, and I've pieced it together because I found that the story that I was looking for wasn't being told. I am now guardian to 2 teenage boys, my nephews, who live with me. Both of them are beautiful and kind people. And they asked me what I was doing here. And I said, I'm trying to tell a story in a way that you will know it, your kids will know it, and you can take it with you forever. And there is no case reporter for this. There is no, and a case reporter can be as inaccurate as anything else. And a case reporter can report things that are not true, that are impossible, that may be fantastic. But I wanted to tell the story in a way that our fantastic was normalized, that our laws were normative, and that we were able to have an oral history that we could pass on. So I tell this once more, Priscilla. If you can tap once, please. I do this not thinking of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, not thinking of the DRIP, the UN DRIP, but thinking of what do I want from these kids that I live with now? What do I need for them? What do I want them to know? I want them to know that you have the right to travel in your own territory. You have, Sylvia McAdam Sesweham tells a story in her book of people crossing into another people's territory and leaving a bundle of sticks there. I want to talk about that bundle of sticks and what that means right now, what that looks and feels like right now. I want the kids that I'm living with, growing with, who are raising me, to know that they have self-determination as peoples. They can determine who they're able to visit, who is a relative, and who can move to their territory. I want them to know that as normal. That's their life. That's their truth. I want them to know that they have the right to live. The Creator put a spark, they are the spark, and the spark continues to flame. The right to live to be old is not an unending right, not guaranteed, but is a principle decided by the Creator, so the Creator decides. And when I speak of determination of self, I want my nephews to understand that they have autonomy in personal decision-making. And the law is, as far as I understand and know it, you have the right to joy. You have the right to be happy, and this is a more than human right, and it's imbued within each of us. In the telling of this story, I tried to understand it in that place and in that understanding. I am one person who comes from Cree and Métis ancestors. I come from Cree and Métis families in the Kelly Lake Cree Nation, Kelly Lake Métis community. I also have a Swedish father. I also have been in urban centers or small rural centers my entire life. I don't speak my language, and none of these are apologies. This is the place that I'm telling the story from. So this is not every Cree Nation story. This is not every Cree person's story. And this is a story that I hope resonates with my nephews so they feel safe and better, and that there is fantastic in the world. In the old days, Chapan Annie could hex you. Her daughter, Cookum Clarice, could cure you. My mama would say, although not around her mom Clarice, that Chapan could take care of troublers. In the range of things, and depending how loving I am allowed to be on any given day, I hope for hexing as a gift more than curing. Ni mama told me that Chapan was mean, that Cookum saw Chapan making her pot full of medicine with my mom and baby girl, after someone had hit baby girl at school. My mom did not tell her mom that the old lady was hexing. I think that she wasn't really mean, but that she had a mean mouth and disliked hard truths. So when my mom told me that Japan was mean, I had to think critically about it. If you could make hexes, wouldn't it be better if you could speak frank truths? You don't have time for flowery language and you're making magic. Just do the thing. Anyways, I'm going to try to be frank here and tell some truths. When I am old or an elder, this is the story I will tell. May this story go where it needs to go. One day, not a long time ago, a young boy whose smile and laughter could touch the walls of a room went out on the land. He loves the land, treats it kind, sometimes feels hurt when others cause her pain. He knows she is mother. That boy, his name is Promise. Living between the spring-summer place where he loves his mama, but he also really likes other people now, too. He was full with happy. Love surrounded and warmed by good feelings in the sun. He played in the water with his relations. He celebrated having breath, friends, family, and laughter. After a day of fun, he got on his ride to go to his camp and go to bed. His ride was hurt, limping along. Promise and his kin tried to get home. Their transport was lame and they needed to stop soon or be at risk without any means to travel. Looking for their way home across the dark, Promise's clan came across a camp they hadn't been to before. Promise recognized it as a temporary camp put up by another tribe on his people's territory. His cousin Rain reminded him that this was Promise's people's territory. It spit sweetly that the land would always be theirs to treat gently, always like a mother. Although he is brave, Promise felt the jubilance leak out of their travel. His kindness, his best friend really, reminded him that the newest tribe could be cruel. But lately, every one of the newest tribe leaders, philosophers, and teachers said at the outset of their great speeches that they acknowledged Promise and his peoples as the real landowners. While he worried about the newest tribe's hard-heartedness, Promise also knew that his ancestors were in the soil under the newest tribe's feet. He also knew that when treaty was made between his people and the newest tribe, the law to bind them would be Creator's law. And that in the process of making treaty, the newest tribe became relations. So on his own territory, but in a newest tribe member's camp, Promise and his cousins approached the camp, hoping to find relatives. Cousin Rain sprinkled down pieces of teaching, notice, recognition, perception. But it was too late. Not a warrior and his son, not a warrior too, raced towards the children as they sat on the perimeter of the camp. The Nada warriors were excited and afraid. The children didn't know what to make of this excitement. They tried to ask for help, and everything hardened in that instant when the Nada warriors' fears shapeshifted into rage. They killed Promise on the spot while he was trying to take care of his family. Pelting them with hardened water, Cousin Rain yelled, "Stop, stop, stop." Too late, too late. They couldn't hear the rain for the thunder. The Nada warriors' people didn't know what to do. They didn't know any of Promise's people personally, so they weren't going to approach them. So they called their stickmen. First, Nada warrior held Promise and his people captive. Then the newest tribe stickman held Promise's cousins hostage, not letting them go for quite some time. Eventually, it was decided that newest tribe stickmen should go to Promise's camp to tell them what their people had done to the beautiful boy. They left Promise where he was and ordered that no one touch him. Cousin Rain flew gently to him and touched him lightly, caressing him while he lay in his mother's arms. The newest tribe stickmen didn't know how to act or behave. They too were camping on Promise's territory without permission. They too did it without the permission that an honored treaty would allow. They too were ruthless and ignored the laws imagined and layered in Promise's territory. These stickmen didn't know how to be humble, and they weren't raised in kindness in the newest tribe, so they behaved badly. The stickmen ran into the camp whooping and started giving Promise's people orders at the same time as they told them that Promise was dead. When the stickmen's orders met the death notice, they hardened and became another weapon, this time hitting everyone left in Promise's family's camp. Do you know that a child, a spirit, is a gift? Not in the Hallmark Channel romantic surrounded by hospital staff and an epidural way. In the you are entrusted with this gift-filled brilliance until they can self-sustain way. My Japan would take all of the babies and school them, teach them how to hunt, what to eat, how to take good care. She knew that our children are a promise reciprocally between the great mystery and people. It makes you wonder about the newest tribe, like when they see our babies crawling and walking around with untethered autonomy and infant agency. Does their tribe know that we are teaching them self-determination while the babies teach us sovereignty? Our women watch the children, it's said, to see what direction they take, and women tell us who the leaders are. We have societies more ancient and more imaginable, and which our people are guided to by their gifts and by women. We entered into treaty with the newest tribe knowing their stickmen were to protect us from the newest tribe. They sent that oath in a prayer with smoke to the Creator and to the newest tribe's queen on signed paper. We are not taught sins, but precedents. This is how you live a good life. This is what happens when you refuse the good life. Precedent in history teaches that these are beings who did not live a good life. Colonial violence is a cash racket. Cash rackets have longevity. Longevity requires a continuum. There was a continuum of violence that day towards our children, towards our land, towards our children's territory, towards our promise, towards our promise. Those stickmen burst into his home and treated Promise's family like criminals merely because they still existed, and loved Promise as if loving him was a criminal act. Our people, even our youngest children, know that killing for no reason must be set right. This is law. That balance between rightfulness and wrong behavior is part of the equation of law. Nada warriors and the stickmen became lawbreakers. When they killed, spirit killed, and splashed their poison on the ground in the rain, in the house, when they broke the land's law, when they broke Promise's people's laws, because they made decisions about how to care for him when his spirit left, as they could not enunciate the link between killing hatred and our Promise's death, they broke their promise. They killed our promise. And if you get soft-hearted for a minute, I want your cousin to remind you, as the newest tribe justice keepers were deciding what to do to equalize, to find justice, the newest tribe clan members circled their horses around Promise's friends and family threateningly while they waited for something they called fairness to emerge from the justice keeper. In that circling, justice itself was strangled, and Promise's people knew they would never see justice again. And Promise's people vowed to make it right by holding the Nada warrior family responsible. They allowed Nada warrior more dignity than Nada warrior or Nada warrior 2 allowed Promise or Promise's people. Nada warrior's people held him gently and took him to a newest tribe justice lodge. The newest tribe invited Promise's family and friends to attend. Everyone in the lodge listened to orations for days on end, and the lodge leader said, after hearing all of this, that Nada warrior did not murder Promise. We know that Nada warrior and his son should come to Promise's lodge, where Promise carried the rocks and kept the fire burning. We know that the relationship requires reciprocity in order for it to be a law-abiding relationship. That Nada warrior's family would offer their son to Promise's family because this is the degree of the loss and recognition of wrongness built into our laws. That nothing can bring Promise back, but that remaining law-abiding and human, Nada warrior would know and show how invaluable Promise was and how remorseful the newest tribe was and family were. Some who will hear this story will continue to call our people savage for this gentle and reciprocal law. The newest tribe's son would live and Promise's laws would come close to balance. These same people will call these same people will not call Nada warrior a savage for killing Promise. The true savagery is that there is no accountability for the death of Promise. That is how unbalanced the newest tribe is. It allows them to kill Promise with no penalty. What is the equivalency of the precedent in this age? How can the Nada warriors and newest tribe make it right? They need to sit with Promise's family and ask them what they require as justice, according to their teachings, according to their law. In attempting to kill the promise of the land, it requires the promise of an actual fairness. If Japan were here, Japan would take Promise's cousins to the stove and teach them how to protect themselves. If Kokum could, she would make a medicine to stop the newest tribe from killing our people. If Nimama could, she would make certain that her children know this story and the laws. And now that I know it, I have to tell everyone who will hear it this truth. You cannot kill Promise. You cannot kill Promise. You do not know how to be law-abiding on the Promise's land. You will need to live and learn this law in order to have a good life. You will carry this legal precedent with you forever. We will know this story, and we will know the words killers. We will know the words and story from this point forward, but this is only part of it. The burden of carrying murder for life, the burden of not making it right, the burden of not engaging in reciprocal relations, all this in Boer, Nada warrior and his newest tribe must carry for their lives. Their children will carry all this too. It's not forgiveness or for some notion of sin that this will happen. It will take place because of the wrong and the unwillingness to meet the law of the land they left Promise on while dying and what it requires. This is heavy, and it will be so. And that story is called The Promise. In order to be a person who is ethical, accountable, and law-abiding, for me to tell a story like this, to sit down and write it, I had to think of it in terms of what a fantastic world could look like, what impossible and fantastic could be, what it would look like if Cree law, if Indigenous law were understood to be just regular, the normal part of life, the part that we're brought up on and we are required to follow, that it is paramount. What would that look and feel like? And I have no doubt made errors while I tried to figure it out. But when I told my nephew, I'm telling the story in a way that I hope that he would understand it. My partner always says, those boys need to hear you talk. They need to hear you speak in public. And I said, I don't think this is what I want them to hear me speak in public. Because there's lots of protocols and laws that I have to observe and have to follow and may have broken and have to address them when I do that. The first is that I want to make sure when I bring this story to a room that I'm not causing Promise's family additional pain, that I'm not raising upset and furor and hurt and alienation and the feeling of separateness from space and people within the room. So the thing that I do is I invite Promise's family into the room. I also make sure that I give the story to the family beforehand and ask them for permission to speak of it, to record it, to say it. And these are not niceties. At any given point, if somebody had come to me and said, you don't have the right to do this, or we don't want you to do this, if Promise's mom had said, you have no capacity to tell this, then I'd be giving an entirely different conversation today. But I'm trying ultimately to follow Cree laws and protocols in bringing it forward. And I also want us to be able to have oral conversations about this that matter and resonate. I want us to be able to say that we are the people, we are the generation, this group of people are the people who said, I'm a member of the newest tribe and I'm going to do something. Because it can't be just for Indigenous peoples, it can't be for Cree peoples, it can't be for Promise's family to resolve, to stand up, to speak up, to show up. Showing up is part of the great gift that you bring into the room, but it has to become part of our normal. So it's not fantastic anymore that non-Indigenous people show up. That you don't take up the space, that you don't take the voice, that you don't commodify or get benefit from doing it. That nobody knows that you're doing it because it's the right thing to do and you show up. In a community that I lived in, a Cree community that I lived in, there was people who came to live there every 4 or 5 years from the Mennonite Central Committee. And the Mennonite Central Committee people would show up in the, it wasn't a reserve, in the community and would do the work. That work could be preparing a kitchen, preparing for a funeral, could be sitting down and talking with you, could be cleaning up somebody's house. After I'd lived there for a while, one of the people from the Mennonite Central Committee, who'd been coming to the sweat lodge every time that we went, was asked to carry the rocks into the lodge. And I tell this not knowing the line between what is acceptable to talk about ceremony and what was told to us to keep underground so it wouldn't be rendered illegal, or that people may have attached fear to when there may have been times when people talked about it openly. Ceremony may have just been like having a meal together. Ceremony may have been just keeping the rocks hot. But on this day at the lodge, there were no young men from the community who were able to lift the rocks and put them into the sweat. And the Okimau asked the Mennonite Central Committee member to bring the rocks in on the pitchfork. And I know in my heart right now that that person is never telling anybody that they lifted those rocks, that they showed up and they did the work. And to me, by analogy, metaphorically, that's what Canadian law, Canadian lawyers, Canadian legal thinkers can do. Show up and lift the rocks. Lift the rocks because you're the person there who has the energy that day. Show up and lift the rocks because you're the person who has the affluence or privilege of not having to go out and hunt for your food on a particular season, or who is able to show up and lift because physically you are able that day. Show up and do the work. When I look at the promise and I stand back from it and think about the work that people should be doing or the work that I can be doing, this is part of me carrying the rocks. And I don't need to be congratulated, and I am not to be thanked. I'm trying to figure out ways within which we make sure that this doesn't happen ever again. And that we don't think of this in terms of impossible and fantastic. We think of it in terms of a Cree legal normative in this territory, or a chief legal normative, that we have accordance and accountability and responsibility that is meaningfully informed, determined, not just sort of consented to by Indigenous peoples, that Indigenous peoples are participating in what feels like normal law, so that not everything we do, not everything we say, not everything we experience within the context of building happy families is thought to be fantastic. Jim Dumont saying every creation story is a true story. When I drafted this story, when I wrote it, I knew that I would be making errors, that I would have overstatements of the law, that I would have understatements or things that I missed because I don't know my language, wasn't brought up in community, that there'll be pieces that I'm missing. But I'm okay with that, because as my elder taught me, we are strong enough to withstand critique. And if my piece is weak or fallible in some way or some place, there's somebody who hears it who's going to be changed and who's going to show up. And that might be my nephews. That might be somebody who feels better about the space they're in to do this. But I want to speak specifically to the people within the legal profession, being hosted as we are by McKercher. The part of us that thinks that this is unfair and there is imparity and that's unfortunate is only useful if that part is going to do something about it. Otherwise, there is complicity in the silence and doing nothing about it. I want us to think about how it is that we make sure that this never happens again. And not in the, let's have a fundraiser and start a scholarship. There's nothing wrong with that. But in the, how is it that we're going to get all peoples living within this territory, living on Promises land, living within the Métis territory here, the treaty land here. How do we make sure that this becomes a part of people's legal normative vocabulary? That discussion at the outset about where you come from and knowing your relationship to the territory. Teaching at the University of Victoria, I teach students who are in the Juris Indigenous doctorate, the first degree of its kind in the world, where people are learning Indigenous laws and legal orders, and also trans-systemically Canadian common law. And in that space where people are doing it this year, we are putting together a podcast, because, you know, I'm old and I think that's innovative. But we're putting together a podcast, and in doing that, I've said to every one of them, I don't need a land acknowledgement from you, but I need to know where you woke up this morning and what your responsibility is to that land and the peoples from that land. I need you to know and to enunciate and make mistakes so other people can do better the next time about what your obligations are to the more than humans, to the whales, what your obligations are to the cedars out here. And for that to become normal, not impossible, not fantastic, for it to become a part of your dialogue. Accept the possibility that there is no impossibility. I'm aware when I do this that I'm also saying, oh, Canadian law is impossible and I don't get it and I don't understand it. In that class where I've asked a number of students to participate in this exercise, there's discomfort all around, because a lot of us have just rejected land acknowledgements as land acknowledgements with no weight. But we've started to talk about them as if we are committed through them. So every time I show up, what am I going to do? What is my obligation when I'm on this territory? Who am I going to support? What rocks am I going to carry? So if I have anything outside of the words that I've placed into the story today, I'm hoping that that idea of what it is to be a member of the newest tribe, what it is to be a member of Original peoples, and how it is that we love our families is shared, taught, and regularized throughout law schools, throughout lodges, throughout round dances. All those places, go to the place where you need to lift the rocks. And I will conclude my comments there. Thank you very much for listening to me today and for coming out. And for those of you online, thank you as well. I can.
Dr. Lindberg has graciously agreed to take some questions, so I will go and get the mic.
First question is always, where'd you get those groovy shoes? You can count on winners, where every day is a bargain day. They're Fly London or London Flies.
Any questions for?
Joseph Natal, I work with as a cultural advisor for the College of Law. But I've been hearing the word Aboriginal sort of still like framed around Indigenous people in Canada. How long is that going to be applied, or is that part of, like they recognize it as part of the law, right? Teaching the students and that.
I'm sorry, Joseph, I need to hear the last sentence again.
Yeah, is that going to be part of the ongoing academic training to teach people that there's still Aboriginal people here? Is that stuck? Is it entrenched? I'm just curious because I'm Nihio, right?
Okay.
And we always frame ourselves around our tribal name, Indigenous name.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I also remember seeing you on campus when I was here when we could smoke on campus back in the day. I think of it this way. At a certain point in time, my mushum was very comfortable using the word within the Indian Act, using the word Indian every day. And then later, as time went by, people started using Native more, so they used that. And then in the 80s, 90s, Aboriginal. Now I think we're using Indigenous the same way. Each time, every generation thinks they're doing a little better. And I've done the same thing here by using Indigenous within the conversation to be able to have a conversation. But I think that part of lifting the rocks means knowing whose territory you're on and how to say it, Nihia. Knowing how to pronounce or enunciate Cree laws from a Cree place that are for Cree people, Cree laws that are spiritual laws, knowing the language for that, and bringing that into the everyday lexicon. I think that my nephew's children are going to be so embarrassed that their auntie's going to be in this archaic footage using the word Indigenous. And I hope that that's the truth. But just like my grandfather got used to using Indian, and I got used to using Indigenous, I think the first rejection has to come from us, and we have to require and necessitate it. The difficulty is that the trip back to your language is often precarious and hard for a lot of people, but precarious and hard is the nature of lifting rocks. So in doing that, I hope to become more fluent, and I hope that it becomes something antiquated and that people don't utilize. I don't hear anybody say Aboriginal anymore. Like, that's just where I'm at. But I'm living in Victoria, teaching at a law school. The reality is probably quite different in a number of places. But I know functionally people use just a broad name to be able to have a conversation. And I often say that I'm comfortable if we use Indian, if we use it as the Latin intended in the image of God. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. There's one more question.
Hey, okay. I've been told to introduce myself. So I'm Kathy.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi. Anyway, I want to acknowledge two elders in the room, Joe Natauhau and Elder Maria Campbell, who are two elders that I respect and admire very much. So I just want to acknowledge them. And thank you so much for your presentation. I found it really moving and really thought-provoking, and the artwork is absolutely beautiful. So first of all, I have a few questions, actually. I'm just wondering, first of all, is your book already available then for purchase?
No. Although if you ask my editor, it's quite complete. The book will be on the shelves in the fall, and it has a publication date of the fall. I tell you when the final manuscript is, but I fear I'd get hives, so I'll just avoid that.
Okay. And I had a couple questions. First of all, the story that you shared, I thought that it was something that you created. So I was really interested, towards the end with your comments when you're talking about how you hoped you didn't, violate any protocols, and particularly the family of Promise, yeah. And so I was just wondering about that, like how you came to get that story.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the other question I have too, and this is something that I think about a lot, is when you're teaching the stories of this place, Nehio stories or Indigenous stories, what is it ultimately that you want, like non-Indigenous peoples, how do you want them to relate with the story? Because we've had one story, right, that's been imposed on us, the colonial story and narratives. And now, we're Indigenous peoples. We've always had our stories, though, too, right? So how do you envision the stories, I guess, coming together?
Thank you. In terms of the made-up story, it's as made-up as any story is, and every story has a precedent. Every story has a place that it comes from. I think of those winter stories that were the hard teaching stories and the role and place within that. In piecing this together, I found myself quite at a loss as an urbanized Indigenous person, as a Cree person, Niheo, as Esqueo, as a person who had a toolkit and didn't want to take space from anybody, didn't want to open up the possibility that any of us could walk out here and have this conversation without thinking meaningfully about the harm you can do. And so for me, it was looking to do no harm. So approaching the family means approaching the people whom the story resonated through and from via and came to me. And before I ever put it anywhere, I put it on a piece of paper and I sent it to the family and had them look at it and said, is it okay if I talk about this in public on this day, someday? I had written it months before this invitation ever came to speak here. Then I said, do I have your permission to be able to tell this story there? And then I've also made clear today in my discussion with family that I will ask every time until they tell me I'm annoying. Billy Ray Belcourt has a piece on Colton Bushy that he won't read in public because he doesn't want to be exploitative or take the voice or take the space or create friction, or he doesn't want to do any harm, is what I read it as. And I understand that as his experience. I'm a member of the Belcourt, Campbell, and Callio families myself, so that logic is not lost on me, that you have an obligation not to take that and put that into the world with harm. But I also thought about the number of places where I'm going to have access to rooms, I'm going to have access to thinkers and speakers, the interwebs, that I can't just talk about comparative Indigenous law and Canadian law for the rest of my life, that I have an obligation to lift the rocks. So that's what I consider this. So in future years, I may say to people, this is a fictionalized story. I don't have a language for it except for this was bloodletting, grief-letting, but it's not mine. I don't have the right to that. But feeling that I had skills or I had a gift and that I had an obligation to figure out what the rocks were, this is me making that exploration quite public and with varying success, I suppose. In terms of the messaging to non-Indigenous peoples, I think for a lot of my personal and professional life, My dad's Swedish. By the way, when I was invited here, they wanted to take me to a Swedish restaurant, and I was really offended. I'm only kidding, the name was Swedish. But that idea of trying to find a space between those worlds where you don't aggrandize one and push another away, and make sure that you're valuing both of them in that conversation, is something that I'm trying to do, but I'm not very good at. In my early career, I think that I focused a long time. In my early life, I focused very much on ensuring that I told law stories that were legally recognizable to Canada, Canadian lawyers, and Canadian judges. It was heart-rending to be in law school and not be good at it, because I'd always been good with words. I'd always been great with stories. But to this day, I can't tell a Canadian law story with any sort of passion or eloquence. That I was told by one of my elders that those stories won't live in me. So I hope that as I grow and as I become more aware and as I go to more ceremonies and spend more time with people that I adore, that I learn how to have this conversation in ways that are useful for our people, where we are lifting the rocks for each other, but also acknowledging that there is a role for the Mennonite Central Committee. They should probably put me in a commercial. There's also a role for Mennonite people. There's also a role for good-hearted, good-thinking people who have the capacity to be able to do it. And what form that takes, what that looks like, well, it may be sponsoring a lecture series. It may be sponsoring a scholarship. It may be ensuring that you are the person who does the drafting and recording and working of the meetings of Indigenous thinkers, Indigenous families who get together to tell you, this is what justice is. If you have the skills and the capacities, then be the person who lifts the rocks. But my message isn't necessarily to non-Indigenous peoples anymore. I'm trying to speak to my nephews now in a way that they will understand and they can carry with them. And also, where they will just naturalize and normalize the language of, I'm self-determining, I'm sovereign, I have the right, I have autonomy, this is my territory. And there are lots of us who say, yeah, we all bring our kids up doing that. I want them not to just say it, I want them to be able to live it. And so that's the work that I'm doing now. Thank you, Kathy.
I know there was one last question. We're running short on time, but one last quick question would be wonderful.
I didn't think she was a lawyer till she started talking and answering questions. Then I could tell she was a lawyer. That's what you're thinking.
Not really a question, but just in addition to Elder Joe Natal. When you go to Europe, we go to Spain, we call them Spanish. We go to Germany, we call them German. And so they should do the same thing here. They can call us Indigenous Territory, Turtle Island, but when you come to this territory, you call us Nehiawak.
Yeah.
Because we're not Cree, we're not First Nation, we're not Native, we're not Aboriginal, all that sort of stuff. So the people that come to our territory need to acknowledge that what territory they're in, and talk accordingly. If you go to Dene territory, you call them what they want to be called. You go to Dakota territory, you ask them what they want to be called, and take the time to respect us in that way.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I agree. And that seems a fantastic place to start and end.
Well, thank you once again, Dr. Lindberg, for, oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. You don't need the microphone? Okay.
Thank you, Tracey. That was beautiful. And I just wanted to say a little bit more about Tracey, because lots of people don't know. She's talking about lifting and carrying the stones. This building is here because of the hard work of people like Tracey and Indigenous students in the 1980s and 90s. Nobody knows very much about that, but they were people who carried stones for people in Kanesatake, people in the Elders Blockade. In case you don't know, it happened in Saskatchewan and it lasted for 3 years. And also for people who were trying to save their forests in British Columbia. Tracey went to jail while she was a law student. And was fighting so that Indigenous students, Cree students here, Indigenous students all over, would be able to have a university education. We just had an elder pass away a year ago who was also a student at the time, and he fasted in Ottawa, left here as a student and fasted in Ottawa so that that could happen. So our people, as students and as faculty in this campus, have carried stones for a long time. And in the times of truth and reconciliation, I'm really sad to see that there's hardly any people here, any students, our own people. And I'm also sad that we don't have faculty from at least some of the other campuses, but also from law. I was at the law college for 6 years, and I just, you know, this is sad. And it's sad that Indigenous Studies isn't here, because those were things that were happening in the 80s and the 90s when there was no truth and reconciliation. So no, as students, you can make lots of change. You can make noise, and you can make things like this possible, but make sure that the people who founded these ideas and made this possible are also recognized, because those students are not recognized in the things that were built in the university over the last 20 or 30 years. So thank you, Tracey, for all the work you did, because she also worked with the Lubicon people for nearly 4 years and carried lots of stones over there. We're really proud of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of the College of Law, thank you again for the lecture. It was wide-ranging, poetic, and much appreciated. I'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation, and please join me in thanking Dr. Tracey Lindberg.